Hey, what's up everybody? This is Brian and I want to welcome you to Saving Data in iOS video tutorial series. In this series, we're going to be covering all aspects of saving data. You're going to be learning how to write and read your objects out to disk. You're going to be learning how to work with the file system through NS File Manager. I'm going to show you how you can integrate XML and JSON into your apps, and I'm going to even show you how you can embed a database, SQLite, into your app as well. Finally, you're going to get a nice introduction to the big dog himself, Core Data. I'm going to show you how it works and how you can integrate it into your app as well. So as you can see, there is just a ton to cover. So let's start it off by diving into NSString and NSData. Before we dive into reading and writing NSDatas and NSStrings to disk, let's take a look at our app's directory structure first. When you install an app onto a device, your app is put away in its own little place. It's its own sandbox, or what Apple likes to say, it's its own island. And everything you do within your app is going to be within this directory structure. You see, once your app is installed, Apple will create a whole bunch of folders that you can use, and each of these folders has its own purposes. And I'll be going into this in just a moment. But as you read and write data, you're going to be doing it in one of these folders. Now, some of you may be interested in reading and writing outside of your directory structure. Well, you can do this, but this is more of an exception. Say if you wanted to read some contact information or get access to one of their MP3 files, you can do this, but you would have to do it through one of Apple's supported APIs. If you just wanted to read and write raw bits outside of the directory structure, this just isn't possible. When you install your app to the file system, you get a whole bunch of directories. And here's some of the more common directories that you'll be working with. The first one is your app bundle. And your app bundle contains all the files needed to run your app. And this is a signed bundle and it's read-only. So if you have an XML document that you need to work with and you want to save that out to disk, you would have to copy that XML document from the bundle to the file system and then do your manipulations on the file system itself. And this is not, the contents of this are not backed up by iTunes. The next one is the documents directory, and this is for all user-generated content. So say you had your own spreadsheet app and your user saved data, you're going to want to save that into the documents directory, and this is backed up. Now, say your user emails a friend a copy of their spreadsheet, and their friend opens that spreadsheet up in the email attachment. That spreadsheet then is copied to Documents inbox. And again, this is where files are opened from attachments, and these are backed up as well. There's also a library folder, and this is for the running of your app. So if you have any configuration files, any binary files, or so forth, this is where you're going to want to put them. And these are backed up as well. Inside your library folder, there's also a caches folder. And this is for the smooth operation of your app itself. So you're going to want to put that in anything that would make your app run faster within the caches folder. And this is not backed up as well. And finally, there's the TMP directory. And this is your temporary directory. So say you had a zip file and you want to unzip the file and then organize all those unzipped files. Well, you would first unzip them into the TMP directory, and then you would organize them from there. The thing to keep in mind with the TMP directory is that when your app is not running, the system may sometimes flush out that directory. So just keep that in mind when working. You don't want to start working on a process and then have the user shut down your app and then be stuck with missing files. When working with the file system, it's really important to understand when things will be backed up or not. Basically, if you're creating large files, you have to keep in mind is that when the user syncs with iTunes or these files are being backed up through iCloud, it's going to slow down the entire process. So if you're working with a non-critical file that may not need to be backed up, you could actually be saving your user quite a bit of time. You can designate files as non-backupable through a key called NSURL is excluded from backup key. There's also a core foundation key called KCF URL is excluded from backup key as well. And you want to use these for really large files that may slow down the whole backup process, and it's going to make your user a whole bunch easier. So just keep that in mind when working with the file system. So I've talked a bit about the different folders that you can access. Now you're going to want to know how to actually access them. So say for instance you want to save a file called myfile.txt, original I know, to your documents directory. How would you go about doing that? Well, the first thing you're going to want to do is actually get an absolute path to where your documents directory is. And you're going to be using a convenience function called NS search paths for directories and domains. And this takes 3 arguments. The first one is the directory that you're looking for. And Apple has provided a bunch of different values that you can use. And the one you're looking for is NS document directory. You're going to pass that in first. The next one Apple's curious this function needs to know is the domain you're searching in. And you're always going to use NS user domain mask. And this is because with iOS, we can only write to our application directory. And in this case, it sort of views it as a user, the same way it would view a user on Unix. So this is kind of like your application's home directory. So you're always going to use that NS user domain mask. The next one is a Boolean that asks if it will expand a tilde. Now, again, in the Unix world, if you want to use your home directory, the tilde would represent a path to that home directory. Well, in this case, in iOS land, we're going to use a tilde to represent our application directory. So we're just going to put yes. It's just a nice convenience method. Once you run this, it's going to return an array, and you're almost always interested in the first result. So you're going to get that, and that's going to give you a complete path to your documents directory. If you're interested in, say, your library directory or your temporary directory, Apple has also provided NS temporary directory or NS library directory and so on. You can check out the documentation just to get a whole list of values that you can put into that first argument. Once you have your absolute path to that directory, you're going to want to now put up the location of your path. And you would do by doing string by appending path component. And what that does is you can just put in your file name, and now you're going to have a complete URL string to that path on the disk. So now you can start writing to it or reading from it. Now keep in mind, this is a nice convenience function. It's easy to use, but Apple prefers you to use the NS File Manager instead. And I'll be covering that in depth in another video in this series. Saving NSData out to disk is relatively simple. NSData provides a method called write to file, and it takes 3 arguments. And the first argument is a path. So you're going to provide an absolute path of where you want this file to be saved to. And you just saw exactly how to create that path. The next option is, the next argument are a pair of options that you can provide, and I'll go over those in just a moment. And the final is an address for an error object. And this is standard error checking in iOS. The method returns a yes or no, and if the method fails to write, it's going to populate that error object for you so you can see exactly what happened. Now, the 2 options that you can provide to this method are NS writing atomic, and that's just a hint to say that you want to create another file somewhere off in the file system that it's going to write to, and when it's done writing to that file, it's going to swap it out with if there's an existing file at the location you provided. The other hint is NS writing without overwriting, which is a hint not to overwrite any existing file. Now, your first instinct may be to convert objects to NSData and immediately start writing them out, but really a better practice for you to get into is to see if there's any other methods in your framework or your application that will write out the current object you are to disk. And if those things aren't available, then go about the conversion and then writing to disk, and that will save you some time and headaches in the long run. Reading NSDatas are also pretty easy to do. It's a simple alloc and a knit. You're going to go a knit from file, and it's going to take a path. So you're going to provide an absolute path of the location of where your file is located. It's going to take a couple options, and again, it's going to take an error object, the address of an error object. And if your object is returned as nil, then you know something's gone wrong, and the error object has been populated, so you can see exactly what has happened. Now, the options that you can provide have to do with virtual memory, or if you want a file to open up in the system cache, and so forth. And going into each of these options a little beyond the scope of this video tutorial, but I provided a link there that provides some really interesting reading to find out how each of those options may impact your app. So definitely check that out. Writing strings to disk is very much like writing NSData to disk. You're going to be using the method write to file. And the first argument that this method takes is a path. And again, this is the absolute place of where you're going to write in the file system. The next is going to ask atomically, and this is a yes or a no value. And you're generally going to put yes, so you're going to say you're going to want a temporary file created. It writes out to that temporary file. Then when it's done, it moves it to the location where you want it to go. The next argument is the encoding. And for the most part, you're going to want to put NSUTF-8 string encoding. And I'll just talk about this in a moment. And the final argument is an error object. And you're going to pass in the address of an error object. And if the method fails, that error object is going to be populated, and you can see exactly what went wrong. Now, regarding encodings, you do have NSUTF-8 string encoding at your disposal, and you also have NSASCII string encoding as well. There's actually a whole lot of string encodings that you can use. And for the most part, unless you have a reason not to use NSUTF-8, you should always use NSUTF-8 string encoding. This is Apple's frameworks have been sort of customized and optimized to use NSUTF-8. So by getting off that path, you may run into problems. Now, getting into string encoding is way beyond the topic of this video tutorial, but there's a really interesting article that I've linked to in this video series. So check that out, and it goes into depth of how all the different NS encodings appeared in Mac development and how and why we use NSUTF-8 today. So check it out. It's a great read. Reading NS strings from disk is almost just exactly like reading an NSData from disk. You're going to do an NSstring, a lock, and then you're going to do a init with contents of file. The first argument you're going to pass in is the path, with the location of where the file is on the disk. The next is the encoding, and again, you want to pass in the correct encoding of that string that was saved to disk. And finally, you're going to pass in the address of an error object. And the way this works, as usual, is that if you get a nil string back, then you know something's wrong, and you're going to want to query the error object to see exactly what happened. Again, it's really important to find out what exactly this object was saved as as it was encoded to the disk. So when working with string encoding, it's almost always you're going to be using NSUTF-8 string encoding, but if it's not NSUTF-8, you want to make sure exactly you know what that object was saved as so that you can have a properly encoded string.
Okay, in this demo, I'm going to be showing you how you can take NS strings and NS datas and write them to disk, as well as how to read them. And it's relatively easy. So I'm just going to start up a new Xcode project. And this is just going to be a regular single view application. And I'm just going to call this saving demo. And I'm just going to save this to my desktop. Well, with this in place, let's start saving an NS string. And the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to be doing this all in app-delegate. But the very first thing I'm going to do is determine where I'm going to save a string to. And I'm going to be saving it in my documents directory. So I'm just going to get a path to that. So the very first thing I'm going to do is do NSArray paths, and I'm going to be using NSSearch paths for domains. And I'm just going to pass in an NS document directory. Always going to pass in an NS user domain mask as well as expand ~yes. With that in place, I'm now going to get the actual path. I'm going to be using a really helpful method they just added to arrays called firstObject. And now I'm just going to give it a file name. By string by appending path component, and I'm going to just give it quote.txt. Now it's time for the quote. It's just going to be a simple, we'll just say 4 and 7 years ago. The Gettysburg Address. And I guess that's not really a quote, but what can you do? All right, so let's come up with an error object, and I'm not going to create a complete error object. I'm just going to create just the error, just the pointer to it. And if there is an error, this will be populated. So now let's write to disk. Quote, write to file. I'm going to pass in the path. I'm going to say atomically yes, so that it's going to create a file, a temporary file. It's going to write it all to it, and then it's going to copy it into the location. I'm going to say NSUTF-8 string encoding, and I'm going to pass the address for our error object. And now let's see if it worked. We're going to check to see if it was successful. And if so, we're going to say wrote quote to disk. If not, we'll just print out the error object. Okay, let's build and run to see if this worked. As you can see, wrote quote to disk. Excellent. Now let's read it back in. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to comment a lot of these out so that we know that we're actually reading this in instead of accessing an already instanced quote. So there it goes. And if you ever want to quickly comment something out, you can just hit Command / and it will add the comments for you. And you can do it also again, select what you need, select the line, and then hit Command / again, it will uncomment it out. Okay, so let's read in the quote. call it loaded quote because it had a few too many drinks tonight. And now I'm going to pass in the path. I'm going to say I want NSUTF-8 string encoding, and I'll pass in the error. And I'll just copy this. And now if there's a quote, let's print it out. We're going to say restored quote. And if not, we have our error. So we're building, and we have our previous quote commented out, our previous saving the quote. We're going to stop, we're going to build and run. And you can see restored quote 4.7 years ago. So that's working with NSStrings. Now we're going to work with NSDatas, and you'll see that it's exactly the same way. And I'm going to be using an image and I'm going to take this image and I'm going to convert it to an NSData, save it to disk, and then I'm going to read it back again. So I have an image already picked out, and that's the troll, because trolls usually pop up in demos. So let's move it in here, and we'll copy. And there we go. There's our troll. So first, let's get a reference to the image itself. Okay, troll face equals UI image named. So now that I have our troll, let's convert this into a data. I'm going to do UI ping representation, and I'm just going to pass in troll face. And this is just a nice convenient method to convert your images to NSDatas. You can also do this to also JPEGs, UI image JPEG representation. And now let's get a path that we want to use. And in here, I used NS document directory. Let's use NS library directory. Let's call this image paths. This is always going to be user domain mass, it's been tilde, yes. And now let's get the NSstring. We'll call this image path. And now we're going to call this the actual file name, string by appending path component. And we'll just call this troll.bin. And now we're going to write this out. And we'll just copy this. Troll face to disk. Otherwise, there we go. Okay. And now let's see if this correctly works. And you can see we have written our troll face to disk. Now with that in place, it's time to bring the troll out. So we have this library here, and we have this all set up, and we have the path all here. So I'm just going to get rid of the writing code. I'll comment this out, and now I'm going to add the reading code. And I'm just going to do an NSData. We'll just call this raw troll data. And we'll say if raw troll data. And this is if there's an error. We'll just print out the error. And this is where we have the raw troll data. We're going to convert it into an image. And we'll print out the address of the troll image. And we can actually see the troll itself. So there it is. We have that. Let's put in our breakpoint here. We're going to go back here and break over here, and I'm going to select Mr. Troll. Here we go. I'm going to select the eye, and you can see we have our troll nicely tucked away in our code. So that's how you can write with NSData and writing with NSstring. It's pretty easy to use, and once you start doing it, you'll find it pretty intuitive.
Well, that's the end of this video tutorial, but as always, we like to end off with a challenge. In your challenge, I want you to download the challenge project, which is just a very simple app. In it, you can just type in strings, and you can also load up an image from your photo library. There's a segmented control of where you want to save that image in your application folders. I want you to implement the saving method. So when you select on the library, I want you to save it into the library folder. If you select on documents, I want you to save it in your documents folder. There's also an additional Uber hacker level challenge, so check out the challenge PDF as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. Thanks for watching. See you next time.